Hey, Emily.
Hey David, how's it going?
It's going well. Hey, everyone. I'm back with Science of Spirituality, where we talk to people doing scientific research or writing on issues related to spirituality writ large. And today I'm here with Emily Esfahani Smith, who's the author of The Power of Meaning, Crafting a Life That Matters. And that's with Crown, and it's coming out in January. She writes about psychology, culture, relationships, and her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, Time Magazine, The Atlantic, and other publications. So, welcome, Emily.
It's great to be here, David.
So, I love the book. I wanted to talk about one story just off the top of my head. The first one that comes to mind is there's a writer, Will Durant, raking his leaves. You know, it's a fall day, sort of raking his leaves, and this person approaches him and says, if you don't convince me that my life has meaning, I'm going to commit suicide. And so you're a philosopher, convince me my life is meaningful, otherwise I'm going to kill myself. So what does he say? What does Will Durant say to try to convince this guy not to kill himself, that life does in fact have meaning?
It's a very gripping story because there he is just kind of going about his daily life, and you can imagine if that were you and somebody came up to you and said that, you would probably be shocked. And I think Durant was shocked, and so he didn't really respond in the most compelling way, I would say. He kind of, told the man to, go have a nice meal. But the man said, "Oh, I'm not hungry." And Durant said, "Well, go get a job." And he said, I already have one. And the conversation in Durant's kind of telling of it ended there, and the man walked away, seemingly unsatisfied with the answer that the philosopher gave him. And I think Durant himself realized that his response was uninspired because he afterwards realized that he didn't really know how to respond to this kind of great question that is the question of philosophy. You know, here he is a philosopher and he doesn't have a compelling answer to this question of what makes life worth living. So he ended up writing a letter to and sending it to kind of the luminaries of his day, from Gandhi to the poet Edward Arlington Robinson, asking these people, where do you find hope? Where do you find purpose and meaning? And many of them wrote back to him, and he compiled these letters into a small little book called On the Meaning of Life, which was published, but compared to his other works, which, were bestsellers, Pulitzer Prize-winning works, this one kind of didn't receive much attention. So when I found it in my research for my own book, I thought that it was this kind of hidden gem because it was such an interesting story, this man who came up to Durant, and I thought Durant's response was very interesting, to kind of reach out to the intellectuals, thinkers, spiritual guides of the day to see what response they would give. And as you know, as I write in my book, the answers that they gave were very varied and wide-ranging. One individual talked about how his children were kind of the meaning and purpose of his life and gave him so much joy. Another person, he was a prisoner and was condemned to a life sentence. You would think that in that kind of grim situation, he would be pessimistic and he would conclude that his own life wasn't meaningful. But as it turned out, he did find meaning in his words, kind of being part of like the bigger world, playing his role, being a small piece of something larger. Gandhi wrote back and said, he finds meaning in service. And so Durant kind of realized that meaning ultimately comes from kind of connecting to something that lies beyond yourself. And that was his conclusion ultimately.
So a lot of people try to define spirituality as connecting to something beyond yourself, but it seems like there's a lot of overlap with meaning here. But I wanted to ask, so I guess you're now in D.C., You just moved to DC. So this fall, if you're raking your leaves out front and someone, walks up to you with the same question, I assume you would hand them a manuscript of your book.
I hope that I would be able to come up with something compelling to say to them. Just to rewind real quick about your point about spirituality, I think that the question of meaning really is a spiritual question, and that we are spiritual beings, which is why we care about whether our lives have meaning, and it's why the question of meaning has traditionally been answered within spiritual systems, religion or philosophy. And I think that, I think a big part of the reason why somebody might come up to me in my yard, or this individual come up to Durant in his yard, is because some of our default kind of systems of meaning, sources of meaning, those spiritual systems are no longer so central to our lives, and they don't quite have the authority that they once had. And they were such... The wonderful thing about, certainly, there are problems with religion and philosophical systems and different ideologies, but one of the benefits of them is that they kind of give you clear answers to the question of what is the meaning of life and how can I lead a meaningful life. And so, for many people who... So
let me ask, so can an atheist be spiritual then and have this sense of meaning that you're talking about?
I absolutely, I think so. And I think one of the things that I try to do in my book is to outline what a meaningful life looks like in a secular culture, basically. Can you, I think for a lot of people today, especially living in the Western developed world, which is growing more and more secular by the day, this is really the question. It's a question of, well, either I'm not religious or I'm not very serious about my religion, or I am religious, but I still have some doubts. Where can I find meaning? Can I still lead a meaningful life? And I think that if you look at kind of Durant's project, writing letters to these different people and seeing their responses, or if you look at the psychological research on meaning, which is kind of growing by the day, or if you just, if you kind of look at, different even religious or philosophical systems, but maybe strip out some of their, theological foundations, you'll see that there are certain themes that kind of come up again and again, which aren't necessarily, requiring religious beliefs. They're just kind of these elements of life, these sources of meaning that we all can tap into.
So Alain de Botton wrote Religion for Atheists, and he makes a sort of similar point in that in some ways we've sort of secularized badly, in that we've left out important components that religious, spiritual, traditional systems had, but he doesn't really go very far into empirical psychology, but your book does a deep dive into, the empirical findings around meaning. Was there a single study or a single statistic that really stood out to you that still, when you think about it, it's sort of surprising and makes the point very well, just how much meaning matters for well-being? I know there are a lot. I think there are two that kind of immediately come to mind. One of them was one of the very, very first studies that I ever encountered on a meaningful life, and it was a study kind of comparing a happy life and a meaningful life. And I guess if you would kind of press me to think about these two different concepts, happiness and meaning, I would have realized, okay, that these aren't the same, that a meaningful life and a happy life look different. But I hadn't really kind of thought too hardly about what the differences might be. And this study really highlighted them. And one of the differences was that, the more likely that you are to kind of people who kind of say that their lives are happy, that they are happy, are more likely to describe themselves as takers. So this idea that happiness is kind of associated with self-focus, even selfish behavior, whereas people who when you say takers, you're talking about Adam Grant's distinction between givers and takers.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
And so givers being people who are essentially more altruistic with their time and energy, whereas takers sort of intuitively are people who are happy to get altruistic behavior aimed at them, but aren't giving it back. So you're saying that happy people in this study were more of the taker type.
Yeah, so that they found that the happy life was more associated with being a taker, and that the meaningful life was more associated with being a giver. And just one of the, they asked kind of the participants all these different questions about how they spend their time, and one of them was, how do you spend your money? And so the happy life is kind of more associated with buying gifts for yourself, buying things for yourself, whereas the meaningful life was more about kind of buying things for others and getting gifts for others. So that's kind of a concrete example. And that really, I thought that was kind of provocative, actually, because our culture is so happiness focused, and yet I think we would agree that we probably want to live in a world where most people are givers instead of takers. And so it suggested to me, well, maybe this goal of happiness isn't the right goal. Maybe meaning is what we should be kind of building our lives around and focusing our lives on. So that was one study. Another study that I thought kind of drove home the importance of meaning in a good life, and there's actually a series of studies related to this, and it's basically about death and approaching death. And when they're psychologists and psychiatrists who study people with terminal cancer, for example, find that many of them are depressed and hopeless, and they are even kind of suicidal and are hoping that they die soon because they have this terminal cancer diagnosis, and they feel like they're they feel despair, basically, and a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear as they approach death, this unknown, this kind of end to everything that they know and love.
Sure.
And one researcher who's based at Johns Hopkins University, I think you're familiar with his work, David, Roland Griffiths.
Yeah, he was on this show a few months ago. Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. Well, maybe you talk about this study, but he's done all kinds of work about how kind of major transcendent experiences, a spiritual kind of mountaintop experience, but which he induces in the lab with psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, how those very meaningful moments can kind of transform someone's life. And one of the groups that he's looked at are terminal cancer patients. And the question that he and his colleagues were asking in this study is, can a major transcendent experience, in other words, a very meaningful experience, diminish kind of the natural fear and anxiety that we have approaching death? And I spoke to one of the women who was in that study, and and it turned out that she was somebody who, when she received her diagnosis, just felt like, in her words, like she was in the wasteland and just really, depressed and adrift, and was spiritual, but didn't really have, any kind of deep belief in an afterlife that might give her hope and consolation as she approached death. But after she had this transcendent experience in the lab, she came out and just felt this sense of peacefulness with respect to her own death. And she, because these experiences can be kind of ineffable, difficult to describe, she didn't really have the words to explain why, but she did say, like, during that experience, I felt connected to something much bigger. And I realized that, as I was breathing in and out, she said that, if I stop breathing, then that's okay. I'm okay with that. And it was just this kind of moment of insight that she had, which resulted from this meaningful experience that made her feel at peace with the fact that she will die. And I thought that was pretty powerful.
Yeah, both of those are really tremendous demonstrations. And it's interesting because they're two, at least somewhat different dimensions of meaning. There's this altruistic style being a giver, and how that relates to well-being. And then on the other hand, there are these intense, transcendent or spiritual experiences. And I can see, if you're talking about meaning as belonging to something larger than yourself, that there's a lot of resonances there, but they're sort of figurative resonances, feeling, but maybe not. Maybe there's a common denominator. If you feel more connected to other people, you're more likely to be altruistic. It's like the identity altruism hypothesis. And then in these mystical experiences or transcendent experiences of these people in the lab who have taken psilocybin, there's this really literal sense of connectedness to something larger. People feel their self boundaries drop away, and there's this intense feeling of connection. So in meaning, do you feel like this connection to something larger than the self is the key part of the definition? Would you say? Is that how you think about meaning?
Yeah, and just I think that what you say makes a lot of sense. That these two experiences are different, but there's something that does, and there is kind of this common denominator to them. And I think it's exactly what you just said, which is that the one of the definitions of meaning, and the one that I use in my book, and think that is accurately captures what we're talking about when we're talking about meaning and a meaningful life, is a connection, connecting and contributing to something beyond the self. And so for some people that might be their families. They feel this sense of connection to this social unit, and it's a unit that they can contribute to in some way, whether through helping their children with their homework, or contributing a salary to help them, to support them basically, or it could be it could be to God. You feel like a sense of connection to God, and or maybe you contribute to. I mean, it's weird to say contributing to God, but you kind of engage in certain acts that are for the sake of your love of God. If you kind of are of a mystical disposition or whatever, and I think that both of those, the giver thing and this study from Johns Hopkins, both of them are united by that connection to something beyond. Because being a giver, by definition, like you're stepping outside of yourself to connect to somebody else and to give to them. And then with the Johns Hopkins study, it is this kind of sense of connectedness to something beyond.
Yeah, I've worked a little bit on the idea of callings, and in callings, there's a similar, it's like a visceral pull, a kind of motivation to step beyond yourself and to give of yourself, and there's sacrifice involved. And a lot of times people talk about the dark side of callings. Do you find something similar with meaning, or is meaning sort of always a positive force in people's lives?
I guess it depends on how you're defining positive and negative in a way, because I think I see where you're going with the dark side of callings, and that if you feel called to do something, if you feel this really strong motivation and sense of purpose towards some goal that you think you have, you're going to pursue it, come whatever, and that could mean that it's a very painful pursuit. Maybe it requires you to kind of leave home, or to give up the comforts that you know and love, and maybe you're sacrificing a more lucrative career in order to pursue your calling. And so there's a lot of sacrifices, and that can be painful, and it can make you even unhappy, moment to moment. So I think that definitely, there is that dark side of it. I think, on the other hand, there's another way to frame it, which is that you're doing something really valuable and important, and that makes your life feel significant in some way, like it matters in some way. And so, maybe you might not feel good, but maybe you still think that what you're doing is really worthwhile in the grand scheme of things.
Right.
And I think it's the same with meaning. You might have a purpose, let's say, to be a doctor who ultimately, discovers some kind of cure for cancer or something like that, and it's, you're working 100-hour weeks and you don't have relationships with anybody really, and maybe because of that you're really unhappy, but you're doing something that's very important. So I think that's a choice that we each have to make, and it's something that it's something that we have to. It's a choice. Yeah, I mean, that's basically, it's a choice that we have to make, and I think that we have a moral obligation in our own pursuit of kind of calling or meaning to make sure that we're not harming somebody else. If we have a family, that we're not kind of abandoning them to pursue this other thing. But I do think that the best thing.
It seems like the moral questioning has to extend to the aims of the group as well. Because if you're giving to the greater good in the form of your society, but your society is advancing immoral ends, then by proxy, you might be feeling a lot of meaning, but you're ultimately advancing group aims that are immoral. I know both you and I have worked with Jonathan Haidt, who draws a lot on the work of Durkheim. And both of them talk about homo duplex, or human on two levels. There's the me level, and then there's the we level. And it seems like the transcendent experiences in the way, and the way that you're talking about meaning, and these and maybe callings as well, are all about stepping from the me level to the we level, and the kind of maybe evolutionarily ingrained rewards that come from that kind of altruism, more eudaimonic forms of well-being rather than more selfish hedonic forms of well-being. But it seems like the shape of that we level is something to really think about in terms of what's going on ethically. It seems like certain groups that are very clearly immoral, like ISIS or ISIL, what they're doing, almost everyone would agree, is blatantly immoral, and yet they're sort of seemingly good at engaging those kinds, pressing those buttons to get recruits, and they're kind of pressing those meaning and calling and transcendence buttons.
I think that's absolutely true. I think that's part of why they've been able to recruit so many people, and why some of their recruits are kind of secular Westerners who felt unmoored in their own culture and yet found something appealing in this kind of apocalyptic, transcendent type of vision that ISIS is promoting. I mean, if you think about ISIS, it gives them a community, it gives them a purpose, it gives them, this promise of a certain kind of afterlife. All of the things that you would want if you're leading a meaningful life, it's offering to you, and yet there's something very deficient about its moral vision. And so I think that, it's important to remember that a meaningful life is, well, we all have a need for it, and I think that in the best sense, it's a wonderful thing to lead a meaningful life if you're kind of grounded in a moral system. That meaning on its own isn't necessarily kind of the highest good, that it needs to be kind of contained by goodness or morality or character, or however you want to put that.
That seems really important. And on the other hand, though, I think raising this kind of objection is really so common, and it's important to look at the kind of scales of these things, you know, and I think what you're talking about is that, sure, there are, you know, this sort of meaning can get co-opted towards immoral ends in some cases, but on the whole, in the vast majority of cases, meaning contributes to personal and collective well-being. In other words, you know, meaning is usually a good thing, even though in certain rare cases it can be co-opted. And I think that's an important message.
Yes.
You talk about the meaning gap, the crisis in meaning. What do you mean by that?
I think, you know, what I'm talking about in that particular chapter is that there are, you know, sadly, there are millions of people out there who just don't have a very good sense of what makes their lives meaningful or purposeful. And I think that, I think part of the reason for that is that, you know, it's a wonderful thing that we live in a society that provides us with so many freedoms and so many choices. And that, you know, as maybe some of our kind of traditional systems of meaning, which we talked about earlier in this conversation, as they've kind of become a little bit less important in our culture, you know, whether it's kind of religion or our communities, that people all of a sudden have been left on their own to choose a path that, you know, that will bring them meaning. And so a lot of people are trying to find meaning in their careers. You know, that's where we spend the majority of our time. And so they put a lot of pressure on themselves to find that one job that's, you know, really meaningful, that their one calling. Other people try to find it in creative pursuits or in starting a family. And other people just have no idea. They kind of have meaning up on this pedestal, and they're trying to understand, well, what is my meaning? You know, what's my purpose? And so I think, this meaning crisis, I think, is just the fact that for a lot of people, there's a question mark when it comes to meaning and purpose. And I think a big part of the problem is what I said earlier, that meaning is such a kind of, it's this big concept, and we put it up on this pedestal that it makes it seem so inaccessible. And one of the things I hope to do is just bring it down and help people to realize, well, there are everyday sources of meaning all around us. And it's not like we have one meaning that, you know, that's our meaning that we have to live out, but rather there are many meanings that are part of our lives every day.
Well, that's very well said. Let's leave it there, and thank you so much for talking about your new book, The Power of Meaning, Crafting a Life That Matters, and we'll provide a link where people can pre-order. And best of luck. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, David. This was a great conversation.